The people who dug, blasted, and built one of the most consequential engineering projects in human history were officially classified as too foreign to belong to the country they built it in. For decades, Panama's own immigration law treated the West Indian workers who constructed the Panama Canal as an undesirable population to be managed, not citizens to be counted. The nation those workers helped create just admitted, in its own most recent census, that they were wrong about the scale of what those workers actually became. Nearly a third of the country is now formally recognized as their descendants. Construction on the Panama Canal, one of the largest and most dangerous infrastructure projects ever attempted, required labor on a scale the small isthmus nation had no way to supply on its own. Between the 1880s French effort and the American-led construction that finally completed the canal in 1914, roughly 150 to 200,000 West Indian workers, overwhelmingly from Barbados, Jamaica, and other British Caribbean colonies, crossed the Caribbean to do the work. They cleared jungle, operated explosives in brutal heat, and died from disease and accidents at rates historians still consider staggering, the human cost behind a project that reshaped global shipping permanently. When the canal finally opened, the workforce that built it didn't simply go home. Many stayed, married, and built permanent communities in Panama, particularly around Colón and Panama City, laying the foundation for what became the country's Afro-Antillean population. The nation they helped build did not welcome them as citizens. The American-administered Canal Zone operated a formal, explicit two-tier employment system known as the Gold Roll and the Silver Roll. Gold reserved for white American employees with higher pay and better housing, silver for black West Indian laborers paid less and segregated into separate, inferior facilities. Panama's own citizenship law compounded the exclusion. Early 20th century Panamanian immigration policy specifically targeted West Indian migrants as an undesirable, unassimilable population, restricting their path to citizenship in ways that treated an entire generation of nation-building laborers as permanent foreigners inside the country they had physically constructed. Given how thoroughly that exclusion was written into law, formal citizenship restrictions, a segregated pay system, decades of official policy treating an entire population as outsiders, you'd expect the descendants of those workers to have remained a small, marginal minority in Panama today, exactly the outcome that exclusionary policy was designed to produce. Before we get to what actually happened, it's worth sitting with how deliberately that outcome was engineered. This wasn't casual social prejudice operating below the surface of an otherwise neutral system. This was formal government policy, written into immigration statutes and enforced through an official segregated payroll system, specifically designed to keep the Afro-Antillean population small, separate, and legally distinct from Panamanian identity for as long as the law could manage it. Panama's own 2023 national census delivered the answer directly. 31.7% of the population, approximately 1.29 million people, now formally self-identifies as Afro-descendant, a dramatic jump reflecting both expanded census categories and, more importantly, a population the country's own exclusionary policies had spent a century trying to minimize rather than accurately count. Nearly a third of the nation. Not a marginal minority contained at the edges of Panamanian society, but one of the largest identifiable population blocks in the entire country. Here's a question worth sitting with before we get to the genetic confirmation. If government policy spent decades trying to keep this population legally separate and demographically invisible, how large was it actually growing the entire time underneath that official effort to minimize it? The genetic data answers that question directly. Among Panamanians who self-identify as Afro-descendant, often using the term Moreno, autosomal ancestry studies find a median Sub-Saharan African contribution of approximately 62%, a figure confirming a strong, direct biological connection to West and Central African source populations, concentrated most heavily in exactly the provinces where the canal workforce originally settled, Colón and Panama province, the historic heart of the Afro-Antillean community. If a government spending decades writing an entire population out of legal citizenship, only for that population to turn out to be nearly a third of the nation, is the kind of institutional failure that gets you fired up, say so in the comments. Because Afro-Panamanian communities have been organizing around exactly this history for generations, and now have both the census numbers and the genetic data, confirming the scale of what exclusionary policy tried to erase. Tell us if your own country's official records undercounted a population you know for a fact was larger than the paperwork admitted, because that specific gap between the official record and the lived reality keeps turning out to be exactly where this channel finds its next story. There's a second, related genetic paradox in Panama worth mentioning, because it runs in almost the opposite direction and reveals the same underlying pattern of undercounted ancestry. Studies of mitochondrial DNA across the general Panamanian population found that 83% carry Native American maternal lineages, a striking majority. Yet Panama's own census records show only 12 3/10% of the population self-identifying as indigenous. The gap runs in the opposite ancestral direction from the Afro-Antillean story, but it's built from the exact same underlying mechanism. An official system of racial and ethnic categorization consistently failing to capture ancestry that the genome, tested directly, confirms was there the entire time, whether the paperwork wanted to count it or not. It's worth being specific about how this exclusionary system actually functioned day to day, because the gold roll and silver roll went well beyond a simple pay gap. Silver roll employees faced segregated housing, separate schools for their children, restricted access to canal zone commissaries and recreational facilities, and, in numerous documented cases, exclusion from promotion regardless of skill or tenure, a comprehensive system of institutional separation modeled closely on the same racial hierarchy operating in the American South during the same decades. Panamanian citizenship law added a second layer on top of the American-run canal zone's internal segregation. Even after workers left canal zone employment and settled in Panamanian territory proper, immigration statutes specifically classified West Indian migrants and their children as a population to be restricted rather than naturalized, creating a population that was, for a significant stretch of the 20th century, simultaneously essential to the national economy and legally marginal to the nation itself. It's worth naming the specific historical moment when this exclusion began to break down, because the shift wasn't gradual or accidental. In 1941, Panama's government under President Arnulfo Arias enacted a new constitution that explicitly stripped citizenship from children of West Indian immigrants born on Panamanian soil after a certain date, a direct legal attack on the very population that had, by then, spent decades building the country's canal-driven economy. That policy provoked sustained backlash, both domestically and internationally, and was reversed within the same decade as political pressure mounted and the practical absurdity of denationalizing a population this economically essential to the country became impossible to ignore. The reversal didn't happen because the government suddenly changed its mind about who belonged. It happened because a population large enough to run a global shipping choke point is, in practice, too large for any government to successfully write out of existence by statute alone, no matter how explicitly the law tried. That failed 1,941 attempt is worth holding up against the 2023 census figure directly, because the two data points bookend the exact same 82-year arc this entire story traces. In 1941, the Panamanian state believed it had the legal authority to simply define an entire ethnic population out of citizenship by decree. By 2023, that same state was formally counting descendants of that population as nearly a third of its entire citizenry, a reversal so complete it amounts to the government eventually admitting, through its own official statistics, that the 1,941 policy had been describing a fiction the whole time. No population that large was ever actually foreign. It just took 8 decades, and a census form willing to ask the question honestly, for the paperwork to finally agree with what had been demographically true since the first Barbadian laborer picked up a shovel on the isthmus. For Afro-Antillean Panamanians today, the cultural imprint of that founding generation is now inseparable from Panamanian national identity itself, from the country's percussion-driven musical traditions to the widespread presence of English-speaking Protestant communities descended directly from the original Barbadian and Jamaican workforce. The Afro-Caribbean Museum in Panama City, housed in a church building constructed by Barbadian laborers in 1910, stands as one of the clearest physical monuments to a history the country's own citizenship law spent decades trying not to formally acknowledge. Congo culture, an Afro-colonial tradition distinct from the later Antillean wave and tracing back to Panama's earlier era of colonial slavery, contributes its own layer to this same broader story. Its masked dances and call and response songs during Panama's carnival season, standing as one of the oldest continuously performed African-descended cultural traditions anywhere in Central America, evidence that African heritage in Panama runs in at least two distinct historical streams rather than one single narrative. What was once treated as a foreign labor force to be managed and eventually sent home has become, by the government's own most recent count, a population the size of a third of the entire nation. What Panama proves, as clearly as any case this channel has covered, is that a government's legal definition of who belongs and a population's actual demographic and genetic weight can diverge for generations before the official record finally catches up. The gold roll and silver roll are gone. The citizenship restrictions that once treated Afro-Antillean workers as permanent outsiders have long since been repealed. But the population those laws tried to keep small, separate, and uncounted never actually shrank to match the story the government wanted to tell. It grew into nearly a third of the nation, waiting for a census form finally honest enough to write the real number down. The workers who dug the canal by hand were never actually the outsiders their own government's paperwork insisted they were. They were, the entire time, building the population that would eventually make up a third of the country, counting them.